So it's great to speak today with Lisa Ingarfield and Sara Gross. How are you guys doing?
Good, thanks.
Yeah, great, Gary. Thanks for having us.
Well, no, it's great to have you on board. Obviously, we've spoken over the years. We did an interview about 18 months ago, but we just did it voice. So it's nice to do faces.
Yeah, was it only 18 months?
It's 18 months ago.
That feels
Yeah.
like 5 years ago.
Yeah. I had really long flowing hair at the time.
Right. That could be it. Threw me off.
So obviously we were talking then, you guys obviously you're co-founders of the Outspoken Summit, the Women in Triathlon Awards, which we'll talk about a bit later. Maybe, obviously the purpose of this is inside the news. So I want to find out a bit about what you guys have been doing. I'd like to find out a bit about the Women in Triathlon Awards. Maybe obviously we have to get the C word out of the way. So how are you doing with COVID? Lisa, maybe how have things been with you?
Well, it's a little bit of a roller coaster ride here in the United States. We have 3 countries represented on this call, so all in different positions. But as most folks know, the U.S.'s infections are climbing again because of some interesting decision making along the way. So I'm largely holed up in my home. I just head out for swimming and running, and that's about it. So it's me and my dog. And my partner most of the time. But it's getting a little old, but I'm definitely feeling that we need to keep being vigilant because it's not looking good here right now.
Yeah. Sara, how about you?
Wow, Lisa's so amazingly diplomatic about the leadership in her country.
Maybe we'll get to that later.
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm in Victoria, Canada. So we did pretty well in the first wave to flatten the curve, as it were. And we have pretty good leadership here that I'm fairly proud of as a Canadian. Doesn't mean we won't have a second wave or that things can't go wrong. But we've been able to, after about 2 months, so April, May, we were able to go back to, I don't know what they're calling the stages. You know how they're calling the stages, different countries, different things. I don't know, but we're at about 60% of normal contact. So that for me, as someone who works from home and really only goes to the gym and comes home, made my life pretty much back to normal for the last couple months, with the exception of travel and all the races that we normally travel to. And I used to cover races with Live Feisty Media. So I do miss that. But in terms of day-to-day life, things are pretty normal right now. And we're just waiting to see what happens next.
Yeah, which is the big unknown, isn't it? Very much big unknown. So maybe you guys give us a quick background as to how you got together. So you're both doctors, both have PhDs. It's obviously a bit longer to introduce you as Dr. Lisa and Dr. Sara. So, but yeah, clearly, you have academic rigor behind you. So maybe if you give us a little background, maybe Lisa, as to how you guys got together, the areas you work on, and what you're working on at the moment.
Sure. So, it was a few years ago now, and Sara was running a nonprofit. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Sara, but you were the chair, CEO, founder, all of the
president,
of Triathlon. And I was in a women's triathlon team at the time and was on their Facebook page, and they posted this advertisement that had come out from Triathlon looking for people to participate in a program. I think it was called Changemakers, maybe something like that. And I was really curious about it. And the post didn't really have a whole lot of information. So I just tapped off an email to this kind of generic Tri-Equal email address asking for more information. And of course, Sara responded with some information. And then she had noticed in my, what is that called at the bottom of your email?
Your footer.
My footer. Yes, thank you. That I had a PhD. And so she just inquired as to what my PhD was in. And so then I shared, and then we kind of started off with this conversation that led to gender equity in triathlon. And so we discovered that we had a shared interest in that particular area. And so that led to a phone call, which led to more phone calls and lots of brainstorming and thinking about ideas, which over the course of about a year led to the Outspoken Summit. I mean, the development of the idea of the summit, then it was like another year before the summit happened. So it was kind of serendipitous, I think, really, that I happened to see the post on the Facebook page and made the decision to email, not knowing who Sara was. So, everything happens for a reason, maybe. So that's
absolutely, it's fated, isn't it? Definitely.
Lisa was my first internet friend. You know, like
really?
a lot of the millennials I work with, because I'm not quite a millennial, are make friends on the internet, and I was always kind of like, how, why? So that was like, oh, I made an internet friend.
But she is a real friend too, though, yeah?
Yeah. So then we became business partners on some of these ventures, but in the bigger picture. Yeah.
So obviously we'll talk a bit about the Outspoken Summit and also the Women in Triathlon Awards in a minute, because I thought what would be really important, because we've got a handful of questions, but we can go on forever, but it's always good to keep these things fairly concise. I think the crisis that we're currently going through is very testing for everybody. And I think the one thing that we can probably explore more than anything else that we'd like to give as much time to as possible would be whether the current situation we're in presents an opportunity for a reset on areas like gender equality, on race, within triathlon and in endurance sport in general, and how you see we might get there. So I don't know, Sara, whether you've got some thoughts on that. As I say, we're in this crisis. Everything is really, a lot of businesses are looking to reset. And does this present an opportunity for widening participation? I suppose is the shorter way of asking the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question, but I'll try my best. Yeah, so the short answer is yes, there is an opportunity right now. But what I want to say before I get to that, yes, is that it's a little upsetting. It actually, I'm feeling feisty today, so here's my real answer. But it's actually for a lot of the people who have been doing this kind of work on diversity and equity for so long, or people who have been working on anti-racism. I completely understand why some people are a little bit angry right now. Like, finally, it took a global pandemic for folks to realize that we actually had like a long way to go in terms of social change and equity. So I definitely have a little bit of that when around that kind of question, a little bit of like, okay. But then of course, the other side of me is completely grateful that so I think because folks ended up staying home, and there was a lot of pent up anger, and then some of the issues around police violence in the US just sparked a movement, and people actually had time, they had energy, they had emotions all over the place, and it sparked a movement. And I think that that's a great thing. And we're in this social moment where we might see a different world coming out of this, or certainly a world where I find folks are listening a little more to and myself included, because I see when I'm saying this, I don't necessarily want to say, oh, like we've been doing the work and all you people just realize. That's not really it. Like, when you're if you're in a position to be doing the work around diversity, inclusion, sexism, like anti-sexism, you definitely realize that it's a lifetime commitment, and there's no beginning and end point, and people are all just somewhere along a path. So I think a lot of folks were like bumped for wherever we all were going into the pandemic. We got bumped further along the path from especially in the North American context. I recognize that things may look a little bit different in the UK, Gary. But yeah, and so do I see there being an opportunity for triathlon? Absolutely, yes. I've always seen DEI initiatives within the sport as being an opportunity to grow and reach different demographics. And so definitely there's something here, especially if we're all working on it.
Yeah. So I suppose the how is the question, isn't it? Because you're absolutely right. It's kind of frustrating that it's taken a pandemic to cause a reset, but it has caused a reset. So we've dealt with it. Clearly, we wouldn't be in this situation having this discussion if there wasn't a pandemic, but we are in this situation. So I suppose the question I'd ask is how do we enable that change now? How do race directors, brands, it's not just about race directors, it's coaches, it's brands, it's every single facet of the industry that services events, if you like. How do we actually break those barriers down, start opening up and widening participation? I don't know, Lisa, if you've got a view on that as well. Difficult, again, really hard question to answer.
Well, I think it's an interesting confluence of issues, right? Because it isn't just the pandemic. It's obviously the overwhelming, in the United States, police violence against the African American community. And that is not a new thing, right? That has been happening for generations. And law enforcement, there's a long history of racism in law enforcement that goes all the way back to slavery, which goes all the way back to the Brits. So we've always traced a lot of this.
Yeah. No, I mean, my office is in Bristol, is on Colston Yard. So, Colston, the statue was taken down. No one was playing a violin when that statue came down, but the statue was there beforehand, and it should have come down.
Right.
And indecision stopped that. So you're absolutely right. It's endemic. So sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no. So I think that we're at a moment in time where these streams have come together, right? That have created the conditions where we can have an honest conversation. But as to Sarah's point, is that folks of color, women, folks with disabilities, trans people have been having these conversations for a very long time, right? And so there's a subset of the population, primarily white people, who are and men who are catching up at this point. And so I think the how, like before you can even get to solutions, part of the how is that there's this increased awareness of my individual role in exclusion, right? And that a person's identity in the world affects their experience in triathlon or running or horse riding or whatever, right? And that you can't keep those things separate. And I think probably one of the biggest examples of that was the Women for Tri Facebook page, where the moderators made some choices about removing some posts from women of color, particularly Black women, about the Black Lives Matter movement and their experiences and their feelings and of lack of safety training, et cetera, et cetera. And those posts were taken down because of this belief that this social, quote unquote, social or quote unquote political speech doesn't have a place in triathlon. And so white people erased the experience of women of color by essentially saying that doesn't belong in triathlon, right? And so while triathlon might be a place of refuge for white people, particularly white men, because they're the folks who dominate the sport, for other folks with differing identities, as the murder of Ahmaud Arbery here in the United States in Georgia demonstrated, is that even training for a triathlon can be unsafe. And that's been a huge wake up, particularly for white people. Women's safety in training has been kind of on the radar a little bit more recently, particularly with the Me Too movement, in terms of, the decisions that I make as a woman about when do I go out? Like, where do I go out? Taking my phone, making sure I'm in safe places, those kinds of things that oftentimes white men don't have to think about. So that is like, for me, the how. We can't get to the how of the solutions until there's kind of widespread acknowledgement that we each have a role in resisting that status quo or perpetuating it. And sitting back and doing nothing and saying, well, triathlon is my escape, that's part of the problem, right? And so I see now, based on this confluence of kind of social circumstances, is that apathy perhaps is dissipating a little bit. And so then that creates the opportunity for discussions like these, or discussions in triathlon clubs, discussions among race directors at USA Triathlon, at Tri Canada, at British Triathlon, about how do we take this new knowledge and this new awareness around the disparate experiences triathletes have, or soon to be triathletes, right? If we want people to come into the sport, and how do we fix it? And I think the fix is going to be very specific, based on kind of geographic and cultural location. And then it can't be just a group of white people talking about what the fix is, right? Like, it has to be, you have to bring in community members who are excluded and who have been working on this issue for some time, and pool those resources to develop solutions.
Yeah, because I think that was one of the themes, because obviously we were talking before, obviously going live, that I sat in your workshop at the Endurance Exchange conference in Arizona back in January. And you made it, I think it was either you or Sarah made the point around, you need those stakeholders with a seat at the table in order that they can help influence and build that dialogue with those groups. Otherwise, they'll always remain disparate groups. Is that right? Is that how you see it? Yeah. Yeah,
and the table needs to be broader, right?
Yeah.
Like, so large triathlon organizations whose C-suite is entirely comprised of white, heterosexual, straight men, right? They are going to develop policies and practices that are designed through their lens. So unless you diversify who's at your leadership table, so women, folks of color, people with disabilities, trans people, so then you have a diversity of thought and perspectives and life experience. Like, the solutions aren't really going to be solutions, because they're just going to largely be what I think is a good idea, but what I think isn't necessarily going to be effective, because my worldview is different, right? I don't have to live with the daily experience of racial microaggressions, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think just to add on there, or perhaps summarize, like, I think if there was one learning moment that we had in the last couple months, it's that a lot of folks realize that racism is an institutionalized, and that it's systemic, right? And by extension, sexism is systemic, ableism systemic. And so saying, I'm not a racist, I don't have racist practice, like seeing it as a personal ethical thing. I'm not sexist because I have a daughter that I'm raising well. Like, these kinds of things are not, these are not valid arguments. Like, racism is a system that we are deciding on how we engage with it, and as is sexism. So if you assume, say you run a triathlon, or you run a retail shop in triathlon, you get to decide how you engage with that system, and that goes to the level of policy leadership right the way through. And I think that's the real learning moment. I think if we can all get on board with that, then we're making change. And that's actually kind of been our focus around the Outspoken Summit from the beginning, was that we felt there were a lot of drives to get more women into the sport, but not a lot of drive to get more women into coaching, up through the ranks of coaching, into the places where women are underrepresented. So.
Yeah. I suppose the other barrier and the other challenge, I suppose, is price. So we did an interview last week with Tom Richmond at CalTri Events. So they have this safe, affordable, accessible mantra, and so their price points appear to be significantly lower than you would get for other races. Is there something that you think race directors will need to do there? We'll probably link this to the next question, which is around virtual racing, so that having that as making triathlon more accessible, triathlon in particular, because it is, for the experience, more expensive than, let's say, a road bike race or mountain bike event would be, or a swim event, for example. So price would be a barrier, but price, if you can lower it in some way, would be an enabler. So as I say, rambling question again, do you think virtual racing has a role there, Sara? Is it something that you think can open doors, or do you feel it's not really relevant because of the way you need to deal with those systemic issues first?
Yeah, I think that's complicated. I mean, ideally, yes. Like, if you can bring something to someone's phone or into their living room onto their computer, then it's going to be more accessible in the simplest level. I think people have to first have heard of triathlon. There's all kinds of other pre-levels. How you roll out the race, just like an in-person race, is going to matter there. There's also a lot of communities for whom the online space isn't as important, say, as, like, I work in social media and media, so that's massively important to me. It's hard for me to imagine folks not having a computer or a phone, but or that might not be as important as the idea of watching a race or participating in a thing online. May be of no interest to people from some communities. So I think I think the solution, or the answer to that question, comes from, like, I could answer it fully if I was talking to a virtual race director and we talked through all the ways that they are marketing their race, all the ways that they're creating the policies for their race. And when you mentioned price point, that's a really excellent point. And sometimes some of the things we've done, it's not necessarily about lowering your price point, especially if you can't afford to do that, because some of the smaller race directors can't afford to do that. So putting that expectation on them might take away local races, take away from local races. But sometimes creating a sliding scale or a scholarship model or some free entries. There are other ways to create access for folks who can't afford your price point too. So I think it's multi-layered, and there's ways to analyze every single data point on what you are doing, and then you'll get there. Then you'll get there for sure. That's a pretty sure way to make sure that you're being inclusive.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, and I would just add it also is being willing to question everything, right? Like procedures and policies and rules that you have used for decades because you think that they're they have an equal impact on people may not actually be the case. And so being willing and open to review all of those pieces. And I think the pandemic has certainly taught us that technology is not equal, right? People do not have equal access to technology. And so with the schools, we have or education being at home has illuminated significantly the disparities that exist, at least in the United States, between urban and rural communities in particular, and access to the internet. So our virtual race is virtually useless for someone who doesn't have good internet connection, right? And so that's something to think about too, because technology, there's a lot of work being done in technology and how it's perpetuating inequality in terms of, because a lot of internet is not available as like the phone is available, right? Like you have phone companies like CenturyLink here in the United States. There's no like equivalent access for internet. Like it's not organized in the same way. And so that's a huge problem, which I think creates a barrier to virtual racing. And then with virtual racing, do you need a smart trainer? Like, you connect into a system, right?
Obviously, for virtual run, you don't. But yeah, for a virtual triathlon, yeah, you would need, generally speaking, some form of smart. Although you could do it just on Strava. You could do a virtual race on Strava or an equivalent platform whereby you go out and you ride your bike.
Okay. So it's not that, because obviously that might add another barrier, right? Then if you need to have access to Ruby or Zwift or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think to Sarah's point, or to reinforce Sarah's point, is it's multi-layered. And I think we often go for a simple, like one word, one thing answer, like how do we fix this, right? I want like the magic wand, boom. And it's just not that easy, because we're talking about generational inequality that's baked into the system. So it's like with Brexit. People would say, people would say, you can't make an omelet, right? Like Brexit, the way that the United Kingdom is entangled with the European Union is like a made omelet. And now you want to extract the United Kingdom from it. You can't unmake the omelet and expect that to be easy and not messy, right? So it's the same thing, I think, when we think about triathlon or sport in general and trying to work on gender and race equality, is that it's an omelet that's generations old. So how do you take the component parts out and remake it? It's really hard. So there isn't one way to do that.
I suppose what you're saying, and in terms of the things that you provide, obviously with the dialogue that you have through the summit, but also like the consulting service, because you do this as well, don't you? You would advise race directors. I'm guessing you just sit down with a blank piece of paper, you look at the biases, you look at all of the communication, as you mentioned, Sarah, marketing, you look at volunteering, all aspects of the process, and then you will kind of, I suppose, disassemble and then reassemble. Would that be a fair way of summarizing how you would operate?
Yeah, I think so. Sarah?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. It depends on, with consulting, it would depend on the size of what kind of work the company wants done. So we're working with one company right now that's doing a fairly big overhaul, and then others that might just want a couple consulting calls. So, but the deeper you dive, the more you get out of it, right?
Yeah.
Plumb the depths that way. Okay, so maybe we can talk a bit about the summit. So you've had to postpone this year, sadly, due to COVID, because it was due to be, was it November time or October, November time?
Yeah, November.
But you're now doing a new initiative, if I'm correct. So that's the Women in Triathlon Awards. Maybe you could give a bit of background to this, Sarah, Lisa, whoever wants to chip in.
Yeah, Sarah, why don't you take the floor?
Sure. We actually started. When COVID hit, we decided to pause the summit. Instead of just assuming we were going to do a virtual race a virtual conference, we just thought, let's wait and see what's happening later in the fall. So last year we had the first Women in Triathlon Awards, and it was held at the summit on the Saturday evening. And we had categories. We had 6 categories of awards. We had sent out nominations earlier in the year. So last year was the first time that we did that. And then this year we decided, well, we can still do the awards even if we have a virtual ceremony. So we decided to, basically then we decided, let's make sure we added 3 awards. So we've got 9 now. right? Let's make sure we get nominations from every corner of the triathlon world, which is something we now have more time for to spread the news. So Gary, in your show notes, if you can put the link to our nomination forms, that would be amazing. So that folks can nominate the women doing great things in their communities, because sometimes women's stories are harder to find, I guess. And we've found there's a lot of women doing amazing things in the sport, and we want to find them and find more of them and celebrate them. So yeah, nominations are open until the end of August. And then this year we also added an awards committee so that it's independent from us. So last year we really struggled to make a fair system to choose the award winners. And because we know so many people, it was
hard to do.
And then a bunch of your friends are nominated, and it's like, how do we be unbiased about this process? So that was a lot of brain power. So we thought this year, let's have a committee separate from us. They create their own process ahead of time before they even see the nominations. And then they select the award winners. So yeah, we're hoping that that's going to be a bigger and better thing. And because it's virtual, we'll be able to share the video. We'll do a live event. We'll be able to share clips of the video as well of award winners.
Yeah. And you're not sponsored for that. Did I see? Is that right? Is it? You had
Yes. Kerr Sports.
I was going to say, plug your sponsor while you can.
Yeah.
That's great. Yes, I think that, very happily show that on the show notes. I'm kind of conscious of time, and it's really, we always try to keep these certainly less than 30 minutes. I'm conscious that time's kind of running. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you just, clearly I could talk with you, well, hopefully you can talk back with me, but I'll talk with you guys for hours, but others probably won't necessarily want to listen. But so maybe we have this final question, which we've asked everyone. So this whole space that we're in, the challenges that the industry is facing, it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on whether we can weather this storm, because there's been a number that's been bandied around, and I think someone emailed it me the other week that up to 80% of endurance sports events could go if there isn't some kind of government support. So obviously there's the Endurance Sport Coalition, lobbying for some funding in the US. Are you worried about the future of the industry, or do you feel that we'll endure, if you excuse the awful pun? Sarah, first, maybe, if you don't mind.
Oh, no, that's a huge question.
I want you to predict what percentage. No, I don't.
See if my predictions come true. I think we'll endure, is the simple answer. I think sometimes there may be some shifts, where some races don't survive and others end up emerging, or new things end up emerging. So there'll probably be a shift. And it might be for the better. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think that we'll, I don't know. I still like to think that the cream rises a little bit, that now folks are more interested in being more inclusive, that hopefully we'll end up with a different looking sport coming out the other side. So it's
a really tough one, isn't it? Because if you're a race director, obviously everyone is aware that you receive the funds. You've got a load of sunk costs prior to race day, and then it's really difficult if you have to cancel that race. So from a race director's perspective, it's very, very difficult. But athletes in general aren't particularly patient when it comes to no refunds or any other policies. It's all about choice and being fair. And it seems to me that those that have handled things delicately, diplomatically, have communicated well, as you say, the cream rises to the top. Treat your athletes well, and the good will come back. You would agree that would be the future, if you like? Maybe Lisa, I see you nodding there. So maybe, do you agree? I don't know, that's the way forward, do you think?
I do think it has given a lot of athletes some pause about their role in the sustainability of triathlon, and in terms of which companies they support and which companies they don't, right? So which organizations have been forthcoming and honest and transparent in their communication and regular in their communication, right? Not just like a sea of silence and then boom, this race is canceled. Sorry, nothing we can do about it. So I think there are more and more triathletes recognizing that where they put their money matters. And I do think that potentially will shift the landscape of triathlon moving forward. I also think there's a greater recognition of our collectivity as a community in terms of community responsibility, right? So my actions affect other people's. And I think the pandemic has particularly brought that into focus in terms of people who are willing to make choices that are for the good of everyone versus the good of themselves. And so that's kind of a broader commentary on what we're seeing, I think, with the pandemic response. But I also think that that is bubbling in triathlon around races, organizations, coaches who are making choices in a way that is most beneficial for all than just for themselves, right? And I don't say that lightly, because I certainly understand we're talking about economic ruin, perhaps, for some people in terms of unemployment rates and loss of income. So it's certainly not an easy path to navigate, but I think certainly we can point to groups, organizations who are perhaps handling this with a little more grace than others. And I do think that will bear out over time in terms of who stays the course and who doesn't.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think, as you say, it's, if you can handle things with good grace, then good comes back to you down the line, I suppose. Karma.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been absolutely fascinating. Always great to speak. Real pleasure. Thanks ever so much for your time, and hope to keep in touch and find out more as things progress for you guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Gary.
Thanks again. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye. Bye.